Um, in the months after I got back, the hundreds of helicopters I'd flown in began to draw together until they formed a collective meta chopper. And in my mind, it was the sexiest thing going. Saver, destroyer, provider, waster, right hand, left hand, nimble, fluent, canny, and human. Hot steel, grease, jungle saturated canvas webbing, sweat cooling and warming up again, cassette rock and roll in one ear and door gun fire in the other. Fuel, heat, vitality, and death. Death itself, hardly an intruder, on page 9. And again, this is one of these very famous passages in this book, and you can see why. So let's go back to it. So there's this sort of, all the helicopters have been and become this sort of one massive, like this sort of god helicopter, which he says is sexy. Remember at the time that sexy, we still sort of use this term this way. Not so much, but men would talk about a machine this way and say, oh, that's really sexy. Yeah, I guess we still do that. You just don't hear it as much. Maybe it's because I'm not hanging around 18-year-olds, 18-year-old men. Not that anyway, okay. But anyway, I was gonna say, not that I miss it. And the sort of bros that were around in my day were, these weren't people you necessarily want to hang around with. There's a lot of stupid sort of just bargain basement misogyny that was sort of part of the culture there. But people do talk about their cars, especially technology, as being sexy. And so he says, saver destroyer. So there's this bunch of paradoxes. It's a saver and a destroyer. It's a provider and a waster. So a waster here is waste in this sense means kill, waste them. But it also is a provider because it brings food, it's going to drop off food and equipment to you. Right hand, left hand. This is because originally when Bell made the Huey, the utility helicopter E1, which became Huey because they reversed the H and the U, there were doors on the sides of the helicopter. And in Vietnam, after a while, they were like, the doors were always open. They're like, Jesus, we're always sliding these doors back and forth. They're kind of like the doors on an SUV. And after a while, they were like, just take the doors off. So they began to take the doors off. And so guys would just ride sitting. You'll see some of them sitting on the sides of the helicopter. The door gunner would be usually on one side. In a gunship, would be on both, probably. And so left side, right side is this, sorry, left side, right side is this, that the helicopter, you could, by pushing on one pedal on the helicopter, because the helicopter is flown with a series of pedals and big levers, basically, which is called a collective. You can, by depressing one pedal, you can have the helicopter rotate on its axis, basically on the rotor. So if you're looking out the left side at one moment, you can look at the left side, and then you can be looking at the right side. Okay, we just turned around. So it's very fluid, basically, and as he says, nimble, fluent. And fluent here is one of these words where it's like fluid, but it isn't quite. It's like this is a weapon that's fluent in war. Canny and human. So it's clever. It's a clever thing. It's canny. It's knowing. And human, it seems to be alive. Hot steel and grease, jungle saturated canvas webbing. Okay, so the webbing that soldiers wore in this war was not nylon. Now we're used to everything being nylon. Okay, not in the 60s. In the 60s and the 70s, the webbing, that is the harnesses that soldiers wore, were made of canvas straps, which were very tightly woven. They were pretty much indestructible. But they bit into the flesh, and they're having a canvas pack, which was fully loaded with 50 pounds of something with webbing on it, like on a webbing harness. This was no gift to you. Your shoulders were going to be sore immediately, basically. But the thing about this canvas webbing, especially in the jungle, is that it's going to get soaked, right? Because you're going to get soaked, because you're going to start sweating immediately, and then you're just going to pour sweat. So all the webbing is going to get wet too. Then it's going to dry out. Then it's going to get wet again. Oh, okay. So you're just going to smell horrible, and this stuff is going to cut into your body more. Okay. So jungle saturated canvas webbing. And it'll probably grow mold. I mean, like, and they're like, oh, it's growing mold. So the original boots, when the men originally arrived in Vietnam, they were given leather boots, which was the standard issue from World War II. You needed leather boots to fight in Europe or in Italy. In Vietnam, leather boots fell apart in a matter of weeks because between the humidity and the molds and the funguses that attacked the laces, they fell apart. So by the time you get to the end of the war, they began to issue what they call Vietnam jungle boots, which were a combination of rubber and nylon, and they actually had an open mesh top. And so what we're looking at is the beginning of high technological running shoes, which will appear about 7 years later. So in the late 70s, around 77, you'll begin to see the first Nike shoe, a lot of that research will have been discovered basically in terms of having a light shoe instead of a heavy shoe, with mesh, with plastic in it instead of leather. And people are like, what kind of shoe is that? This will become the thing. Or canvas, because tennis shoes were, say, made of canvas up until into that time. Okay. Sweat cooling and warming up again, because the helicopter will go down. It's the only way to get cool. One of the only ways to get cool in Vietnam was to go up in a helicopter, because at, say, 5,000 feet, the air is cool. So you have guys that are shivering, then they come down and it's 120 degrees. So they've gone from cool to super hot. Cassette rock and roller, Dorgan Empire, and the other. Yeah. Okay. So these helicopters did have sound systems, and as you see in the Ride of the Valkyries, they wouldn't all have those big speakers, which would be used for psychological operations, or psyops as it's called. But they did have sound systems, and so they could actually blast out rock and roll. So they put on rock and roll and they would go flying and fighting. So you actually could have music at war. So, in one ear you'd have rock and roll, and then there'd be a door gunner who was, cranking away with the rounds. Fuel, heat, vitality, and death. So the thing is entirely about life, but also death, right? Death itself, hardly an intruder, because this machine is essentially death. It's death. I am become death, as the prince says in the Bhagavad Gita. You can see how attractive the helicopter is, partly because it's so alive and it's so in and out of the jungle and so on. And Herr understands the conundrum of using technology as a cure-all. And despite his love for the helicopters, he points out on page 13, air mobility, which is what this is called. There's the official name for the helicopter war is air mobile. Air mobility, dig it. You weren't going anywhere. It made you feel safe. It made you feel omni, everything, but it was only a stunt technology. Mobility was just mobility. It saved lives. It took them all the time. Saved mine, I don't know how many times, maybe dozens, maybe none, right? So ultimately, the thing about moving people around is that you're sort of reorganizing the deck chairs on the Titanic. I mean, it sort of becomes, like you're going everywhere, but also going nowhere. The war isn't going anywhere. So if technology is only a stunt and can't win the war, well, then what about information at war? Okay, and now we will move along.